For more than 1,000 years, there was no independent state called Vietnam, no sovereign dynasty, no national title, no political autonomy in the conventional sense. Yet for more than 1,000 years, the Vietnamese people did not disappear, were not fully assimilated, and never stopped resisting erasure from history. Chinese domination, known as the period of 1,000 years of northern rule, was not merely a story of invasion. It was a long historical process in which a people lived under foreign control while quietly preserving their identity, adapting to survive, and preparing for the moment of self-rule. Failed uprisings, short-lived governments, and long periods of apparent silence were not signs of submission, but stages in a prolonged struggle against permanent subjugation. This video does not present the Northern domination as a list of disconnected events. Instead, it follows the continuous flow of more than a millennium of history to answer three fundamental questions. Why were the Vietnamese able to endure foreign rule for so long? Why did successive Chinese dynasties fail to fully assimilate this land? And why did independence emerge not from a single battle, but from 1,000 years of preparation? This is the story of a people erased from the political map, yet never erased from history. In Vietnamese history, the period of northern domination did not begin with a single moment of collapse. It was not the defeat of a dynasty in one decisive battle, nor the day a ruler formally surrendered. Northern domination began as a long, gradual process, quiet and persistent, in which the Vietnamese people were slowly removed from control over their own political destiny. After the era of the Hung kings, the state of Ao Lak under An Duong Vuong marked a transition from a tribal society to an early form of statehood. The construction of Co Lo Citadel demonstrated an advanced level of military organization and engineering for its time. Yet Ao Lak remained structurally fragile. Central authority was shallow, connections between communities were loose, and political loyalty was still tied more strongly to local regions and kinship groups than to a unified national identity. When Chiao Da advanced southward from the north and absorbed Ao Lak, the collapse did not occur overnight. It was less a result of outright military defeat than of internal weakness. The kingdom of Nam Viet emerged on this territory, but Nam Viet was not an independent Vietnamese state in the modern sense. It was a kingdom ruled by a Han Chinese elite, even though it accommodated local customs and incorporated Vietnamese elites into its administration. This accommodation delayed the realization among the Vietnamese that sovereignty had already been lost. Indigenous culture continued, daily life remained largely intact, and foreign authorities still felt distant. For the Han dynasty, however, Nam Viet was never meant to last. It was a temporary entity, an obstacle to the complete unification of the empire. Once the Han grew strong enough, the elimination of Nam Viet became inevitable. In 111 BCE, Han armies marched south. Nam Viet fell. There was no prolonged resistance, no single decisive battle remembered in legend, yet the consequences of this event were profound and enduring. For the first time, Vietnamese lands were directly incorporated into the administrative system of a foreign empire. There was no longer a native king, no national title. Instead, the territory was reorganized into commanderies and districts according to Han imperial logic. Jiao Qi, Kuyu Chen, and Nyat Nam were not merely geographic labels, they signaled the transformation of the Vietnamese from political subjects into administrative objects, no longer masters of their own state. From the outset, northern domination was not a temporary military occupation, it was a long-term project. The Han dynasty did not seek only taxes or frontier security. Its goal was to transform this land into an inseparable part of the Han world. This objective was pursued not only through military force, but through administration, law, economy, and above all, culture.
Officials from the north were appointed with full authority over life and death. Han law was imposed, taxes and corvée labor became a permanent burden on the local population. Chinese characters, Han rituals, and Confucian ideology were instruments of governance and assimilation. In the eyes of the colonial administration, Vietnamese customs were backward and uncivilized, something to be replaced by Chinese civilization. Yet the Vietnamese response during the early phase of northern domination was not constant rebellion. This is often misunderstood in simplified historical narratives. At that time, the population was sparse, the economy heavily dependent on agriculture and nature, and there was no leadership class capable of organizing sustained, large-scale resistance. Direct confrontation with an empire like Han China was virtually impossible. Instead, the Vietnamese chose survival. They withdrew into village communities and preserved what they could. Bloodlines, ancestor worship, agricultural practices, and the native language became invisible fortresses. This was not submission, but a form of silent resistance. The Vietnamese did not abandon their identity, nor did they sacrifice themselves in futile confrontation. Within this silence, tension slowly accumulated. As the colonial administration grew more exploitative, as Han officials became increasingly brutal, and as taxation and forced labor exceeded the limits of endurance, social pressure in Jiaoqi intensified. The Vietnamese could endure, but not endlessly. They could wait, but not forever. By the early 1st century CE, the conditions for an uprising had fully matured. Local leaders were marginalized, the population was heavily oppressed, and the divide between ruler and ruled became unmistakable. Northern domination had shifted from an administrative condition into a conflict over identity itself. All that was needed was a spark. That spark did not come from a powerful army, but from two women. When the Tring sisters raised the banner of rebellion in the year 40, it was not merely a reaction to the death of Thi Sac or the cruelty of the Han governor To Ding. It was the inevitable outcome of nearly 2 centuries of political dispossession. It was the moment when the Vietnamese, after being erased from the political map, stood up to reclaim the right to govern themselves. From this point forward, the history of northern domination entered a new phase, one in which silence ended and resistance stepped into the light. In the next part, we will examine the Tring sisters' uprising, its deeper historical meaning, and why a rebellion that lasted for a short time came to define the anti-northern spirit of the Vietnamese for nearly 1,000 years to come.
When the Chung sisters raised the banner of revolt in the year 40 CE, it was not an impulsive act by two individuals driven to desperation. It marked the moment when tensions accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of northern domination finally exceeded the limits of endurance in Jiaoqi society. The brutality of the Eastern Han administration, epitomized by the governor To Ding, was only the final trigger. The deeper cause lay in the prolonged deprivation of Vietnamese political autonomy, while the very institutions that sustained Vietnamese society, village communities, local customs, and indigenous elite leadership, were increasingly encroached upon. The Chung sisters came from a powerful local elite family in Mei Lin, a class that occupied an intermediate position between the indigenous population and the colonial administration. This group felt most acutely the shift in Han policy from accommodation to repression. When Thi Sac, the husband of Chung Trac, was executed, it was not merely a personal tragedy. It sent an unmistakable message. The Han state would no longer tolerate any form of Vietnamese autonomy, even at the local level. The uprising erupted rapidly and spread with a speed that caught the Eastern Han authorities by surprise. Within a short time, the forces of the Chung sisters captured more than 60 fortified centers.
This cannot be explained as a spontaneous outburst of anger alone. It revealed that networks of local leaders still existed, that resistance had long been simmering beneath the surface, and that Vietnamese society was ready to rise once a unifying symbol emerged. When Trung Troc proclaimed herself ruler, the act carried historical significance far beyond the brief lifespan of her government. For the first time since being absorbed into the Han commandery system, the Vietnamese re-established a native political authority on a broad territorial scale. Though the administrative structure remained rudimentary and cannot be considered a fully developed state, the act of self-enthronement affirmed a fundamental principle. The Vietnamese did not accept permanent reduction to the status of imperial districts. The existence of this autonomous regime posed a direct challenge to Han imperial authority. For an empire founded on the ideology of universal unity, the loss of Jiaoqi was not merely territorial, it was a dangerous precedent. The Han response was decisive. Ma Yuan was dispatched at the head of a large, well-organized force with superior logistics and battlefield experience. The confrontation was, in essence, an unequal struggle between a nascent revolutionary government and a mature imperial war machine. The defeat of the Chung sisters in 43 CE was therefore not unexpected. What is more revealing is the Han response after victory. Ma Yuan carried out severe reprisals, dismantled centers of resistance, restructured the colonial administration, and intensified assimilation policies. These actions demonstrate how seriously the Han court regarded the threat posed by the uprising. Militarily defeated, the Chung sisters nonetheless achieved a historical victory. From this point onward, northern domination could no longer exist as a condition passively endured. The uprising created a collective memory. The Vietnamese could rise, could reclaim self-rule, even if only temporarily. This memory did not vanish with the suppression of the revolt. It became a precedent and a psychological foundation for future generations. Following the Chung sisters' defeat, the colonial regime tightened its grip, yet it also confronted a new reality. This land was far more difficult to govern than previously assumed. Every harsh policy increased the risk of resistance. Every act of repression planted the seeds of instability. Northern domination entered a phase in which surface calm concealed persistent tension beneath. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 248 CE, these tensions erupted once more, this time in the form of Lady Trio. If the Chung sisters represented the elite leadership of the Red River Delta, Lady Trio emerged in a different context, when Chinese authority had penetrated more deeply and administrative control had become more sophisticated. This made her uprising harder to spread on a wide scale, yet endowed it with exceptional symbolic power. Lady Trio did not represent a recently lost native regime, but a people who had lived too long under foreign rule. Her words, preserved in later tradition and perhaps idealized over time, nonetheless reflect the core spirit of the age, the desire to control one's own destiny, even in the face of overwhelming power. Her uprising was swiftly suppressed, but it confirmed that anti-Chinese resistance was not a transient phenomenon tied solely to the Chung sisters. It was a continuous undercurrent throughout northern domination. The commonality between the Chung sisters and Lady Trio lies not in military outcome, but in historical function. Both arose at moments when Vietnamese society had been compressed to its breaking point. Both demonstrated that Chinese assimilation had limits. The Vietnamese could adopt technology, writing systems, and administrative models, yet they did not relinquish the right to self-determination. After these uprisings, the northern authorities recognized that brute force alone was insufficient. Repression was increasingly combined with softer forms of control, culture, ideology, and administrative integration to sustain long-term rule. Paradoxically, this shift ushered northern domination into a new phase, one in which the Vietnamese simultaneously resisted and adapted. absorbed foreign elements while maintaining distance. The Chung sisters and Lady Trio were therefore not endpoints, they were foundational markers in a long tradition of resistance that would span centuries. Every later uprising, large or small, bore traces of these early rebellions. Northern domination ceased to be a one-sided narrative of ruler and subject. It became an ongoing struggle in which Vietnamese identity was forged through repeated defeats. Following the Lady Trio's defeat, the colonial regime tightened its grip, yet it also confronted a new reality. This land was far more difficult to govern than previously assumed. Every harsh policy increased the risk of resistance. Every act of repression planted the seeds of instability. Northern domination entered a phase in which surface calm concealed persistent tension beneath.
After Lady Trio's uprising, Northern domination entered a new phase, quieter on the surface, yet deeper and more complex in substance. If during the first 2 centuries conflict between the Vietnamese and the colonial authorities often erupted into open rebellion, from the 3rd century onward, the situation changed. The northern dynasties had learned from earlier uprisings. Brute force alone was insufficient to control a land with a strong identity and a resilient tradition of resistance. As a result, colonial strategy gradually shifted from overt repression to systematic control. The administrative apparatus was strengthened and made more efficient, yet also more flexible in its engagement with indigenous society. The colonial government allowed certain Vietnamese local elites to participate in local administration, provided they accepted the overarching imperial order. This concession did not arise from benevolence, but from the necessity of long-term stability. From this point on, Northern domination was no longer a crude occupation, but a complex system of rule in which the Vietnamese were tightly supervised, yet still retained limited space to survive. Within this framework, the Vietnamese village increasingly became the core unit of social life. With political power stripped away at the highest level, the Vietnamese focused on preserving autonomy at the lowest. The village was no longer merely a place of residence, it became the primary arena for cultural preservation, religious practice, and communal organization. Local customs, rituals, and informal codes continued to operate alongside imperial law. This created a dual structure of authority. Political power lay with the northern rulers, but social foundations remained distinctly Vietnamese. At the same time, a new generation of indigenous local elites gradually emerged. No longer defined solely by kinship or traditional authority, they were increasingly educated in Chinese characters, familiar with imperial law, and knowledgeable about the workings of the colonial administration. This group served as intermediaries. They assisted the northern authorities in governing local populations, while also protecting community interests to a certain extent. Their existence reflected a crucial reality. The Vietnamese were learning how to survive, adapt, and accumulate strength from within the system of domination itself. During this period, culture and ideology assumed growing importance. Confucianism was promoted as a tool of governance, reinforcing hierarchy and administrative order. Buddhism, however, found especially fertile ground among the Vietnamese population. Unlike Confucianism, which was closely tied to political authority, Buddhism addressed the spiritual needs of an oppressed society, emphasizing compassion, suffering, and liberation. The widespread adoption of Buddhism was not accidental. It reflected a collective search for moral refuge and inner autonomy within a tightly controlled political environment. The expansion of Buddhism also contributed to the emergence of cultural and religious centers that lay partially beyond direct colonial control. Temples were not merely places of worship, they became spaces for communal gathering, intellectual exchange, and the quiet preservation of identity.
Within these spaces, collective consciousness and aspirations for independence were nurtured gradually and persistently. Adaptation, however, did not mean acceptance. Beneath the appearance of stability, tensions continued to build. Whenever the colonial authorities increased taxation, intensified corvée labor, or intervened more deeply in village structures, resistance followed. Uprisings during this period did not always reach the scale of the Trung Sisters' rebellion, but their frequency revealed a fundamental truth. Northern domination was never a genuinely peaceful condition. The accumulation of these tensions reached a turning point in the 6th century when historical conditions were ripe for a new breakthrough. After centuries of survival within the colonial framework, the Vietnamese had not only preserved their identity, but also acquired experience in organization, warfare, and political administration. Indigenous leadership was no longer focused solely on resistance. It began to envision the creation of an independent state. Li Bi emerged in this context. Unlike earlier rebel leaders, his objective was not merely to expel colonial officials, but to establish a new political order. In 544, he proclaimed himself emperor and founded the state of Vạn Xuân. This was not a symbolic gesture. By assuming the imperial title, Li Bi asserted sovereignty and equality with the northern dynasties. After centuries of being treated as imperial districts, the Vietnamese declared themselves an independent polity, politically and ideologically. Although the state of Vạn Xuân was short-lived, its creation marked a fundamental shift in the history of northern domination. From this point onward, the aspiration for independence was no longer a reaction to oppression, but a clearly defined political goal. The Vietnamese had begun to experiment with state-building, military organization, and territorial governance under real conditions. The collapse of Vạn Xuân under renewed northern pressure did not erase the significance of this effort. On the contrary, it provided invaluable lessons in political organization, warfare, and the limits of indigenous power within a regional context. These lessons would be inherited and refined in the centuries that followed, as northern domination moved towards its final stage. From the era of Li Bi and Trio Quang Phuc onward, northern domination ceased to be a simple story of ruler and subject. It became a prolonged process of preparation for the emergence of a more durable, independent state. The Vietnamese had learned how to rise, how to fail, and, most importantly, how to resist assimilation. When larger, more strategically organized uprisings eventually emerged, when the consciousness of self-rule had fully matured, and when historical conditions finally converged to bring an end to more than 1,000 years of dependence, northern domination would give way to a long era of independence in Vietnamese history.
After the collapse of the state of Vạn Xuân, northern domination did not come to an end, but it also never returned to the conditions of its early centuries. From the 7th century onward, the Vietnamese entered the final phase of northern domination, a period in which foreign rule still existed in name, yet it lost its capacity for complete assimilation. What unfolded during these centuries was no longer a series of isolated rebellions, but a prolonged and deliberate preparation for an inevitable separation. When the Tang dynasty established its authority in the south, Vietnamese lands were organized as the An Nam Protectorate. The name itself reflected the political mindset of the Chinese court. The southern territory needed to be pacified, tightly administered to prevent instability. In reality, however, Tang control over An Nam never reached absolute effectiveness. Geographic distance, cultural divergence, and the deeply rooted village-based social structure imposed clear limits on imperial authority. By this time, the Vietnamese village had evolved into a fully developed system. Communities lived according to norms they maintained themselves, governed by customary regulations, local rituals, and indigenous beliefs.
The colonial administration could levy taxes and appoint officials, but it struggled to penetrate the internal life of each village. This created a form of de facto autonomy, unrecognized in political terms, yet real in everyday practice. At the same time, the class of indigenous local leaders and intellectuals continued to mature. Unlike earlier centuries, they were no longer defined solely by local influence, but by their ability to navigate both Vietnamese culture and the administrative system of the North. They were literate in Chinese characters, understood imperial law, and knew how to use the mechanisms of colonial governance to protect communal interests. This marked a significant stage in the political maturation of the Vietnamese under foreign rule. Despite continued efforts to maintain control, the Tong authorities faced recurring instability. Whenever policies became excessively harsh or local interests were severely threatened, resistance resurfaced. The uprisings led by Mai Tuk Muan and Feng Hung were not merely reactions to economic oppression, they represented a new phase in the logic of resistance. These movements extended beyond purely local revolts and demonstrated broader coordination and organizational capacity. Mai Tuk Luan emerged from humble origins, yet was able to mobilize large forces, forge alliances across regions, and directly challenge Tang authority. His decision to proclaim himself emperor, even briefly, reflected how deeply the concept of sovereignty had taken root in Vietnamese consciousness. Independence was no longer an abstract aspiration, it had become a concrete political objective supported by multiple layers of society. Feng Hung continued this trajectory at a time when the An Nam Protectorate was weakened by internal turmoil within the Tang Empire itself. He established control over the central region, earned popular reverence, and created a prolonged power vacuum. The significance of his uprising lies not in its duration, but in what it revealed. The colonial administration no longer possessed the capacity to impose order unconditionally. From the 9th century onward, the balance shifted further. The Tang dynasty entered a period of decline marked by weakened central authority and the rise of regional military governors. An Nam, already difficult to control, drifted even farther beyond imperial reach. In this context, the Vietnamese moved beyond resistance towards practical self-governance. Local leaders assumed military and economic control, built independent forces, and maintained order according to indigenous norms. This was the stage at which northern domination still existed formally, but had become hollow from within. The Vietnamese no longer waited for a symbolic uprising. They accumulated power, experience, and confidence. The belief that self-rule was achievable spread more widely than ever before. By the late 9th century, as the Tang dynasty collapsed, the power vacuum in An Nam became unmistakable. Local forces rose without seeing themselves as representatives of any northern court, but as the legitimate stewards of the land itself. Northern domination had ceased to function as an external imposition. It survived only as the fading shadow of an obsolete order. All these transformations brought history to the threshold of a decisive break after a millennium of dependency. The conditions were finally complete. Vietnamese society possessed resilient village structures, a mature leadership class, extensive experience in resistance, and, most crucially, a shared conviction that independence was no longer distant or unattainable. At the decisive moment when northern domination formally ended, victory did not come from a sudden emotional uprising. It emerged from the convergence of 1,000 years of preparation. It was the culmination of endurance, adaptation, resistance, and learning, marking the point at which the Vietnamese stepped beyond northern domination and entered a long era of sustained independence in their history.
As Vietnam entered the 10th century, northern domination had not yet formally ended, but in essence, it no longer had the capacity to endure. Northern authority over Annam at this point existed largely in name only, sustained by fragmented administrative structures and commands that could no longer be effectively enforced.
Meanwhile, Vietnamese society had evolved into something fundamentally different from what it had been nearly 1,000 years earlier when Northern rule first began. The Vietnamese people were no longer a disorganized, subjugated population. Over centuries, they had built a resilient village-based social system, developed a native leadership class with experience in administration, military organization, and politics, and accumulated sufficient knowledge to operate an independent state. Ironically, a millennium of Northern domination became a prolonged process of political and administrative training, during which the Vietnamese learned how to govern society, organize armed forces, and maintain order even without nominal sovereignty. After the collapse of the Tang dynasty, China entered the chaotic period of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. The northern power was no longer a unified empire capable of projecting sustained control into the south. In this power vacuum, the Vietnamese began to exercise de facto autonomy. Local strongmen, long accustomed to self-governance, no longer viewed themselves as officials of a distant Chinese court, but as leaders of their own land. It was in this context that Cuc Thuy emerged. His assumption of control over Ting Hai Quan was not the result of a large-scale armed uprising, but rather a near-natural transfer of authority. This fact reveals a critical historical truth. Northern domination did not collapse because it was decisively defeated in a single battle, but because it had lost the very foundations that allowed it to exist. When Cuc Thuy, followed by Cuc Hao, implemented administrative reforms and reorganized governance to align with local realities, the Vietnamese, for the first time in centuries, managed their country through a coherent and indigenous system. However, this autonomy remained fragile. Northern powers, especially the Southern Han, refused to accept the loss of control over Annam. For them, the region was not only economically valuable, but also politically and symbolically significant. Losing Annam meant acknowledging the decline of Chinese authority in the southern frontier. In this tense environment, Xiong Ding Nye and later Ngo Quen carried forward the path of self-rule. Xiong Ding Nye built a strong military force, laying the groundwork to defend this nascent autonomy. Yet when he was assassinated, the danger of renewed northern domination became immediate. The Southern Han intervened at once, viewing the instability as an opportunity to reassert control. Ngo Quen emerged as an inevitable product of these historical circumstances. He was not merely a military commander, but a leader who deeply understood the regional balance of power, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of both his own forces and the enemy. When Southern Han troops invaded, Ngo Quen avoided direct confrontation on land where the enemy held advantages, and instead chose the environment most familiar to the Vietnamese, the riverine landscape. The Battle of Bạch Đằng in 938 was no stroke of luck. It was the culmination of centuries of resistance, intimate knowledge of terrain and tidal patterns, and a mature strategic mindset. The use of wooden stakes planted beneath the riverbed combined with tidal movements demonstrated a level of organization and military thinking that had reached full maturity. When the Southern Han fleet fell into the trap and was annihilated, it marked not just a military defeat, but the complete collapse of any attempt to restore northern domination. The victory at Bạch Đằng brought more than 1,000 years of subjugation to an end. More importantly, it clarified the deeper meaning of that moment in Vietnamese history. Northern rule ended not simply because the North had suddenly weakened, but because the Vietnamese had grown strong enough to determine their own destiny. This was a result of a long process of accumulation, from the first resistance of the Trung sisters, the unyielding spirit of Lady Trio, the early state-building efforts of Li Bi, the maturation of village communities and local elites, to the administrative reforms of the Cuc family. When Ngo Quen proclaimed himself king, it was not merely the founding of a new dynasty. It was a declaration that the Vietnamese had moved beyond merely surviving under foreign domination and had entered an era of writing their own history. Northern domination, with all its suffering and trials, had completed its role in shaping the nation. Looking back on the entire millennium of Northern rule, it becomes clear that this period was neither a void nor a purely dark age. It was a time of extreme testing, but also one in which Vietnamese identity, communal consciousness, and the aspiration for independence were forged. Without this experience, the Vietnamese sense of autonomy in later centuries might never have become so strong. The story of 1,000 years of northern domination therefore does not end at Bạch Đằng. It lives on in how the Vietnamese confront challenges thereafter. Constant vigilance for the loss of sovereignty, a deep conviction that independence is a core value, and an enduring understanding that freedom is never granted but achieved through long and deliberate preparation. From that decisive moment onward, Vietnamese history entered a new chapter, the era of independent dynasties, where the Vietnamese no longer needed to prove their right to exist, but instead had to learn how to preserve and develop the independence they had reclaimed after more than 1,000 years of waiting.